I know how deeply you, the entire nation, and I think I may say the whole world, sympathize with me in the irreparable loss we've all suffered.
Before the palace corridors had filled with footsteps, before Camilla's household had received its first briefing, King Charles placed his pen against a single sheet of cream paper and changed the balance of the monarchy. The directive was not announced from a balcony. It was not debated before cameras. It was signed shortly after dawn, witnessed by only 2 aides, and it transferred the role once promised to Camilla directly into Sophie's hands. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles remained seated at 5:40 that morning inside a private Windsor study, his fingers still resting beside the unsigned page. The operational directive, a written order controlling how royal duties would be assigned, named Sophie as his principal female representative for state receptions, diplomatic hosting, Commonwealth engagements, and sensitive ceremonies. Those responsibilities mattered because they placed one woman beside the monarch whenever Britain's relationships, prestige, and stability were being tested before guests. The king lifted his pen, then stopped. Camilla had been promised this place during the earliest planning of the new reign, when he assured her that becoming queen consort would mean more than carrying a title. She had expected to guide the public and diplomatic life surrounding him, to shape the rooms where alliances were strengthened and private tensions were contained. Yet a list of recent ceremonial failures lay beneath the directive, and each recorded mistake made his promise harder to defend. Charles read the final page once more. His expression tightened. Then he signed. Sophie received the telephone call before breakfast and lowered herself onto the edge of a chair without speaking. The trusted confidant felt no triumph. She understood that the appointment would place her directly against Camilla, and she knew the queen consort would not see it as a simple adjustment of duties. Sophie asked whether the decision was temporary. The aide answered that it had taken effect immediately. The directive carried one further command. Every future state hosting briefing, the confidential preparation file used to organize guests, protocol, and diplomatic risks, would reach Sophie before Camilla's office. That single instruction reversed the existing chain of influence and ensured the new authority could not be quietly obstructed. Camilla received no personal warning from Charles. Her private secretary was handed only a sealed summary after the order was already active, proof that the king had chosen speed because he feared resistance. As Sophie's first official folder moved through Windsor, another copy crossed the threshold at Clarence House. The signature had taken only seconds, but when Camilla finally opened the envelope, the wound it created reached far beyond one ceremonial role. The directive did more than rearrange royal duties. It forced 3 people to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. Charles had to choose between loyalty and stability. Sophie had to decide whether duty justified stepping into another woman's promised place. And Camilla, who had endured decades of hostility to reach the heart of the institution, was suddenly being told that proximity to the king no longer guaranteed possession of his trust. Camilla read the document twice at the breakfast table. Her tea remained untouched. The directive, a formal written order assigning royal responsibilities, did not describe a temporary change or a short-term substitution. It gave Sophie continuing authority, meaning the trusted confidant would now hold influence long after the immediate crisis had passed. That mattered, because royal power often lived less in public titles than in who received the first briefing, who entered the room prepared, and who was trusted to speak when pressure rose. Charles understood the danger. He had come to see the monarchy as increasingly fragile, strained by public suspicion, family division, and the fear that one careless moment could overwhelm years of careful work. The king no longer believed senior royals could afford hesitation, personal feuds, or sudden departures from protocol, the agreed rules governing royal conduct. He needed discipline. He needed calm. Most of all, he needed someone who would remain steady when emotion threatened to take control. Sophie had earned that reputation slowly. She had spent years handling private diplomacy, easing tense conversations, and calming difficult rooms without demanding praise. Yet when she told Edward what had happened, she did not sound victorious. She said the appointment felt like being handed a key while the rightful owner was still standing outside the door. Edward listened without interrupting. He reminded her that responsibility was not theft, and that refusing the role would not restore trust already lost. Still, Sophie remained troubled. She knew Camilla would see the decision not as an operational correction, but as a personal wound delivered by the family she had fought so hard to enter. Charles had gone further than anyone first realized. He granted Sophie access to confidential diplomatic preparation papers, private briefing documents previously reserved for the king, the queen, and the heir. That access meant she would know sensitive concerns before receptions began and could shape decisions before Camilla's office even entered the discussion. William already knew the directive was being considered. His silence showed that Sophie's rise was not impulsive. The future king had supported a deeper plan to surround the monarchy with people who could be trusted under pressure. Camilla soon discovered something darker. The transfer had been triggered by one ceremony, one humiliating evening when her actions forced Sophie to rescue the crown from public embarrassment. To understand why Charles broke his promise, the palace had to return to the reception everyone had been ordered never to discuss. The breaking point did not come during a grand constitutional crisis. It came in a reception room filled with diplomats, polished silver, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Camilla had been expected to lead the evening. Instead, one disputed seating change, one cutting exchange, and one closed door left the monarchy without its principal hostess minutes before the guests arrived. Sophie stepped forward because no one else could, and Charles never forgot what happened next. Camilla had arrived at St. James's Palace determined to control every detail of the Commonwealth Women Leaders' reception. The event brought together senior female leaders from across the Commonwealth, the group of nations linked historically to the crown, and the Queen Consort was expected to welcome them before leading a private discussion on behalf of Charles. The evening mattered because one mistake could be read as disrespect between governments, not merely tension inside a royal household. Camilla noticed Sophie standing near the central receiving position and demanded that she be moved. Precedence, the formal order deciding where royals stand and who is greeted first, gave every placement political weight. She argued that the trusted confidant's growing prominence was creating confusion and weakening her authority. Sophie remained calm, but she warned that the new arrangement would separate an elderly visiting president from the interpreter she depended upon. Camilla heard defiance where Sophie intended protection. She told her not to interfere with decisions above her rank. The words landed hard. Sophie stepped back, humiliated but controlled, while the Queen Consort repeated the demand to a senior aide. The aide refused. He explained that the approved plan could not be changed safely with guests already approaching. Camilla froze, then declared that she would not host an engagement where her authority was being questioned. She turned away and left through a side door, leaving the room without the woman meant to lead it. Sophie had only minutes. She moved into the receiving position, restored the original seating, and welcomed every delegation by name. The trusted confidant kept the elderly president beside her interpreter, guided the private discussion, and never allowed the guests to realize that the evening had nearly collapsed. Charles watched from an adjoining room. The king saw Sophie absorb the humiliation, protect Camilla from public embarrassment, and rescue an engagement that carried diplomatic consequences. He said nothing until later that night, when a visiting head of state asked him privately why the woman who had saved the reception was not already leading such occasions. The question stayed with Charles. By morning, he had ordered a confidential performance review, a private assessment of how senior royals handled official duties. Its findings led directly to the Dawn Directive Camilla, now held in trembling hands. Camilla could endure whispers, altered schedules, and cold courtiers, but she would not accept replacement without confronting the man who had once promised her the role. There were no courtiers in the room when Camilla placed the directive before Charles, no private secretaries, no advisors to soften the language or interrupt the silence. Only a husband, a wife, and a promise that had been quietly withdrawn. She did not ask whether the order was genuine. She asked why he had chosen Sophie, and when Charles answered, the confrontation stopped being about royal duties and became a reckoning over trust itself. Camilla had demanded the meeting at Clarence House before the household could prepare a formal response. Clarence House, the London residence long associated with the king and queen, was more than a royal address that morning. It was the place where private promises had once been made, where difficult years had been survived, and where she now intended to force the truth into the open. The Queen Consort dismissed every aide before Charles entered, leaving no official witness to what came next. Camilla placed the directive between them and reminded him that he had once promised she would never again be made to feel secondary. She had endured public hostility, private doubt, and years of waiting to stand beside him. Now, after reaching the heart of the institution with him, she felt herself being pushed aside inside the very structure they had fought to enter together. Charles did not interrupt. The king let her speak, until her voice sharpened. She accused him of rewarding Sophie for undermining her at the reception. She said the trusted confidant had challenged her authority, embarrassed her before staff, and then accepted the very role that had been promised to someone else. Camilla kept her anger controlled until she asked the question beneath every accusation. Had he been waiting for an excuse to remove her? Charles answered without raising his voice. He said the decision was not punishment, it was protection. The crown, the monarchy as an institution, rather than the person wearing it, could not depend upon someone who might leave when challenged. The words struck harder than anger could have done. Camilla stared at him, shaken by the suggestion that he no longer trusted her to remain steady under pressure. Camilla demanded that he suspend the order. Charles refused. He slid the directive back across the table and told her Sophie's first engagement had already been approved. The role was active. The decision had moved beyond discussion. Charles then disclosed the final blow. William and Anne had both been consulted. The future king supported the transfer, and the Princess Royal believed duty had to outweigh personal promises. Camilla understood instantly that reversing the order would require open conflict with the senior family. Charles left without reconciliation. Camilla closed the door behind him, but her anger no longer belonged only to her husband. It had shifted towards Sophie, the woman she believed had accepted what should never have been offered. The confrontation ended without reconciliation, and by afternoon, the struggle had moved from a marriage into the machinery of the monarchy itself. Charles may have signed the directive, but he did not arrive at the decision alone. Behind the sealed folders and altered schedules stood an unlikely alliance. William, determined to prevent another public failure; Anne, furious that personal rank had repeatedly overshadowed duty; and Sophie, who had never asked to become the center of a royal power struggle. Together, they formed the quiet force Camilla had feared, the part of the family that valued reliability above promises. William had studied the confidential report from the Commonwealth reception in complete silence. The report, a private written record assessing how the event had been handled, showed that Sophie's intervention had prevented a diplomatic embarrassment that might have dominated international coverage. The future king understood why that mattered. One failed reception could damage trust between the palace and visiting governments, while also making the monarchy appear divided, careless, and unable to control its own household. The prince hesitated before supporting the transfer. He knew Camilla would not see his involvement as neutral. She would believe he was weakening her authority before becoming king, and he understood how easily that suspicion could deepen the fracture between them. Yet William also knew that silence carried its own cost. If another crisis unfolded and he had done nothing, the failure would belong to him as well. Anne reached her conclusion more quickly. She believed ceremonial authority, the power to direct official events and represent the crown, had to follow performance, not affection. During a private conversation, the Princess Royal watched Charles struggle with guilt and reminded him that love could shape private life, but it could never decide who protected the monarchy during a crisis. Charles looked down at the report and admitted that breaking his promise to Camilla felt like betrayal. The king feared that removing her authority would reopen wounds she had spent years trying to survive. Anne did not soften her reply. She told him that keeping a promise after trust had failed might feel compassionate, but allowing instability to continue would be far crueler to the family, the institution, and Camilla herself. Sophie remained the most uncomfortable member of the alliance. The trusted confidant had never asked to become the center of a royal struggle, yet the directive gave her authority to convene planning meetings across several royal households. That meant she could call staff together, settle operational disputes, and approve arrangements before Camilla's office was consulted, even while the queen consort kept her title. William insisted on one safeguard. Sophie could not build a personal court. Sophie could not build a personal court. Sophie a loyal inner circle, designed to increase her private influence or turn service into public competition. Her authority had to remain quiet, practical, and tied entirely to duty. The first proof arrived almost immediately. Palace staff began redirecting briefing boxes, official vehicles, and reception plans away from Clarence House and toward Sophie's residence. The decision had been private, but its consequences soon became impossible to hide, especially when Camilla watched the palace begin functioning without her. Royal power is rarely removed with a dramatic proclamation. Sometimes it vanishes through smaller cruelties. A briefing folder that no longer arrives, a car that is reassigned, a chair left empty, a telephone that stops ringing. Within 24 hours of the directive, Camilla began to see the true scale of what had happened. Sophie was not simply taking one engagement. She was inheriting the daily machinery that had made Camilla indispensable. Sophie's office received the complete preparation file for an upcoming diplomatic reception before sunrise. The file, a confidential collection of guest concerns, speaking notes, seating authority, and emergency instructions, gave the trusted confidant control long before the first guest arrived. That mattered, because whoever held the information could shape the evening, prevent offense, and decide how the monarchy responded when diplomacy became difficult. Palace staff received another instruction soon after. Every future female-led ceremonial event had to reach Sophie for approval before final arrangements were confirmed. A ceremonial event meant an official royal occasion, governed by strict rules of order and representation. The change transformed the chain of command immediately. Camilla still carried her title, but the decisions once placed on her desk now traveled elsewhere. Camilla entered her morning office and stopped. The large red briefing box that usually waited at the center of her desk was missing. She asked where it had gone, though the queen consort already knew the answer. Her private secretary hesitated before explaining that the box had been redirected under Charles's instruction. Camilla dismissed the staff. Silence followed. She sat alone and lifted the engagement card bearing her name from the center of the desk. The card had once confirmed that she would lead the annual diplomatic gathering, the same occasion used to reassure foreign representatives that the crown remained stable and united. Now it felt like proof of a future that had been removed without warning. Sophie learned that the gathering would become her first assignment in the new role. She understood the cruelty of the timing. The trusted confidant would not inherit authority quietly behind palace doors. She would exercise it at the exact event Camilla had expected to command, making the transfer visible to courtiers, diplomats, and eventually the public. Camilla considered refusing to attend. For one sharp moment, absence felt like the only dignity left to her. Then her secretary warned that staying away would confirm the central concern written in the performance review, that she withdrew whenever her authority was challenged. The trap was complete. If Camilla attended, she would watch Sophie occupy the place she had lost. If she refused, she would prove Charles right. Camilla finally reached for a sheet of paper. She wrote only a few lines and asked that the note be delivered by hand. The message requested a private meeting with Sophie, without Charles, William, Anne, or any palace official present. The first fallout had stripped Camilla of control, but the next meeting would determine whether Sophie inherited only the role or the bitterness attached to it. Sophie expected accusation when Camilla entered the room. She expected anger, perhaps even a demand that she refuse the appointment. Instead, Camilla asked a single exhausted question. Had she known before the directive was signed? The answer mattered, because this was no longer a contest between two royal women. It was a private test of honesty between one woman who felt discarded and another who had been elevated without ever seeking the cost. Sophie had chosen a small private sitting room, with no aides present and no connection to either royal household. Neutral ground mattered, because a palace office could make the meeting feel like a challenge over rank, while this room offered no desk, no staff, and no official barrier between them. The trusted confidant wanted Camilla to hear the answer without believing it had been prepared by Charles or softened by advisors. Camilla sat opposite her and asked whether she had campaigned for the position. Sophie answered directly. She had been informed only after the king signed the directive, and she had seriously considered refusing it. The queen consort studied her face, searching for hesitation, but the reply did not change. Camilla's composure finally broke. She admitted that losing the role felt like confirmation of her deepest fear, that no title, sacrifice, or year of service would ever make her permanent in the eyes of the family. She had fought to stand beside Charles, endured judgment to remain there, and now another woman held the authority she had believed was secure. Sophie did not celebrate the confession. She told Camilla that she would never accept an arrangement designed to humiliate her. The trusted confidant offered to ask Charles for a defined ceremonial role, meaning a respected public position with clear duties, but without control over daily planning. That would allow the queen consort to remain visible beside the king while preventing another struggle over operations. Sophie then disclosed the condition she had given Charles in a private telephone conversation before formally accepting. She would serve beside him only if the transfer was never presented as a personal victory over Camilla. The appointment had to protect the monarchy, not create a public winner and loser. Camilla did not apologize for the reception. She still believed her authority had been challenged. Yet she admitted that leaving the room had been a mistake and that Sophie had prevented the evening from collapsing. It was the first time she acknowledged that the directive had not grown entirely from conspiracy or betrayal. Camilla agreed to attend Sophie's first major reception. The two women did not forgive each other, and they did not become allies. But they left the room with one fragile understanding. Neither would turn the next engagement into a public act of revenge. Their private meeting produced no friendship, but it created something the palace had almost lost: a path through the crisis that did not require anyone to be destroyed. By the next morning, the secret was no longer contained within royal walls. Newspapers carried the same extraordinary image: Sophie arriving alone with the king's diplomatic briefing folder beneath her arm, while Camilla entered through a separate door minutes later. The palace had issued no explanation, yet the message was unmistakable. Britain was watching a new royal order take shape, and every expression, gesture, and carefully chosen chair became evidence. Sophie reached the diplomatic reception, knowing that nothing about her arrival would be treated as ordinary. The palace had released a restrained statement, confirming that she would take on expanded responsibilities at state and Commonwealth engagements. State engagements are official occasions involving the monarchy and national representatives, while Commonwealth duties connect the crown with the wider family of nations linked to Britain. The statement avoided any mention of Camilla's lost promise, but its silence made the change feel even more serious. Broadcasters moved quickly. One evening presenter called the decision the most significant shift in female royal authority since Charles became king. The phrase spread because it captured the true scale of the moment. Sophie was no longer simply helping. She was now carrying responsibilities that shaped who stood beside the monarch, who received sensitive information, and who represented calm when the family itself appeared divided. Sophie remained composed, but she understood that every step would be judged. The trusted confidant knew some would see duty, while others would see ambition. She also knew Camilla was about to enter the same room and face a humiliation no palace statement could hide. Camilla arrived minutes later. The queen consort paused when she saw Sophie positioned beside Charles, then continued forward without lowering her head. She refused to give the cameras an image of retreat. That choice mattered, because one visible hesitation could have turned private pain into a public collapse. The newspapers had already chosen their symbol. One front page appeared beneath the headline, "The Dawn Switch," showing the sealed directive beside photographs of Sophie and Camilla facing in opposite directions. The image reduced an intimate betrayal to a national argument, and Britain immediately divided over what it meant. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace as the reception began. When Sophie's car passed, one woman lifted a handwritten sign reading, "Duty earned this." Another voice called for compassion toward Camilla, reminding those nearby that public service did not erase private suffering. Charles heard none of the shouting inside, but the king understood the pressure waiting beyond the gates. He had one final gesture left to make, and it involved the chair beside him. The public had chosen its symbols, but the final verdict would come from Charles when both women entered the same room and saw where he expected them to stand. The decisive moment contained no speech and required no announcement. As the diplomatic guests entered, Charles approached the chair at his right, rested one hand against its back, and looked toward Sophie. Across the room, Camilla saw the gesture and understood that the directive was no temporary experiment. The role she had been promised had passed permanently to another woman. Yet what followed prevented the moment from becoming an act of public humiliation. Sophie took her place beside the king and began the reception with calm authority. The gathering followed strict protocol, the formal system that decides introductions, seating, and the order in which guests are received. That mattered because one mistake could offend a visiting delegation, while one moment of confusion could expose the family's private struggle to the world. The trusted confidant guided each introduction carefully, corrected a delay involving two senior guests, and kept the evening moving without drawing attention to herself. Camilla remained in the room. The queen consort accepted a respected ceremonial position, meaning she still held visible honor, even though she no longer controlled the planning behind the event. Her decision to stay carried weight. Walking away would have confirmed every concern that had led Charles to sign the directive. Remaining meant facing the loss directly, in front of the people who already understood what had changed. Charles watched her from across the room. The king knew that protecting the monarchy had required him to break a promise made during some of the hardest years of their lives. He had chosen stability, but the choice did not feel clean. It carried guilt, sorrow, and the knowledge that duty could wound the people standing closest to the crown. Sophie briefly met Camilla's eyes before the formal greetings continued. The queen consort gave one restrained nod. It was not surrender. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition that the transfer was complete and that neither woman would turn the moment into a spectacle. Charles thanked Sophie publicly at the end of the reception, but he avoided any language of victory. The monarch praised her service, then crossed the room and left beside Camilla. In that single act, he separated his marriage from the authority he had reassigned. Sophie did not celebrate afterward. She closed the briefing folder, returned it to an aide, and told Edward that the role would survive only if she treated it as a burden rather than a prize. He understood that she had gained influence, but she had also inherited the responsibility of carrying another woman's disappointment without exploiting it. The Dawn Directive had not declared Sophie more royal, more loved, or more important than Camilla. It declared that trust inside the monarchy would now be earned through consistency. Camilla lost the role because a promise could not outweigh repeated instability. Sophie received it because, when the crown faced embarrassment, she remained in the room. By nightfall, the chairs had been cleared and the palace doors had closed. But the meaning was settled forever. Charles had chosen duty over a promise. Camilla had endured the consequence, and Sophie had accepted the responsibility without turning another woman's loss into her triumph. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.